he'll wield the scissors. Thank you.
Jeff, I don't care what they say about people in suits. You know, we have to, hold up the honor. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our first keynote speaker, and that's Dr. Jeffrey A. Hunker. And about a week ago, he just got a new job. He is now Senior Director for Infrastructure Protection on the National Security Council. You know, prior to that, Jeff was the Director of the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office. And as Director of that office, he was responsible for bringing together an integrated national plan for addressing both the physical and cyber threats to the nation's information and communication system, transportation, banking and finance, key government services. Now, he also coordinated a national education and awareness program, as well as developing legislative and public affairs initiatives. Prior to joining the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office, Jeffrey was Deputy Assistant to the Secretary of Commerce. And it's unusual because Jeffrey brings to the government the private sector interest, because he was a Vice President of Corporate Finance at Kitty Peabody in New York. And he has an AB in Engineering and Applied Physics from Harvard College and a doctorate in Business Administration from Harvard Business School. Now, let us welcome Jeffrey Hunker, and we have his view graph set up, so welcome.
Well, thank you, John, for an introduction that my mother, I know, paid you to give, so thank you. The one thing that, as we get the technical issues here dealt with, the one thing that John did not mention that I think is relevant for today and for this hotel, for the last year and a half, I've been the director of the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office, and I'll get into what that does in a moment, because I'd like to describe to you basically today a lot of the work that's taking place, not just in the federal government, but across the nation in dealing with information security. Well, if you put the initials of the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office together, you get CIAO. And I can think of no better place than the Venetian Hotel to say, ciao, baby. It's probably no better place than Las Vegas also to admit that I have a dependency problem. And in some ways, I'm happy to have a dependency problem. I have a dependency problem on information systems. And so do we all. Just last week, in fact, the federal government came out with a report talking about the benefits of electronic commerce, and it noted that since 1995, in a world where the U.S. economy has been growing stronger and more rapidly than it has for decades, if not forever, in fact, information technologies accounted for a third of that growth. A pretty spectacular figure if you think about it. And you see it everywhere. I mean, you see it in the hotel rooms here, where we have to bring our own computers, but we have a fax and we have the downlinks available in each of the rooms. We see it in the electric power industry, where through the development of OASIS and other systems, we see electronic trading and management of the national grids. We see it in the growth, albeit small in terms of dollars, but large in terms of percentage rates in terms of electronic commerce. We've seen it for decades now in banking and finance and in telecom. We also have a convention that's coming up in another day or two where we also celebrate a tradition that's been growing in America and that's been very important, which is hackers. And I'm looking forward to that other conference as well after this one. What is new about all of this, and what I really want to talk about, is something that's developed in the last 5 or 8 years, which is not only do we have a dependence on electronic systems and information systems, Not only do we have individual hackers, whatever their names, whatever their handles, but we have a world now where a number of nations that are hostile to the U.S. and several terrorist groups that are well-financed, and quite arguably a number of organized crime elements, are systematically developing organized capabilities to attack U.S. information systems. And that's new. That didn't exist 10 years ago. And it's both new and it's frightening, and it's something that I, and not only a number of people in the federal government, but increasingly a number of you and a number of your colleagues are beginning to become very concerned about. Next slide, please. I'll make certain, by the way, that there are copies of these slides that are available for those who would like them. Let me just note what's new in the world. We've dealt with hackers, individual hackers, whether they be the outsider for fun or for individual profit, or the insider for whatever motivation, for a long time. What we haven't dealt with is the tagline that I'm talking about on the top of this slide, which is, we know of foreign governments that are creating a systematic and sophisticated capability of attacking the U.S. through cyber warfare means. There are a couple of countries that whose senior officials have made public statements about this. They include Russia and China. There are other countries, many of whose names I think you could probably guess, that are also investing systematically in this capability. There is good evidence that in fact there are, on a covert basis, operations ongoing right now against the United States from some of these new capabilities that are there. That's the issue that we're dealing with, and I wanted to, as we're dealing with over the next 2 days, the issues of information security and whether we're wearing a black hat or a white hat, it's the issue that I wanted to frame for all of you. Next slide. The President has been concerned about this issue, and as part of a larger trend of new and emerging threats against the United States and against the United States homeland for a number of years. And the context of this is the fact that terrorists and other nations are not stupid. They can look at what happened during the the Gulf War, now almost 10 years ago. More recently, they can look at the success of the military air action against the Republic of Yugoslavia. And it doesn't take very much to figure out that in an armed conflict against the U.S. and our allies, it is probably true that other nations are going to lose and other terrorist groups are going to lose. If you're smart and you're a terrorist or you're another nation, you ask the question, well, what are the asymmetric threats? What are the ways that I can attack U.S. interests? What are the ways that I can attack and degrade what the U.S. holds dear and get away with it? And there's a couple of answers that are emerging. One of them is chemical and biological warfare. A second is the use of radioactive and radiological weapons. Capabilities, new capabilities for attacking us at home and causing mass damage. And a third, and the one I really want to focus on, is cyber warfare. Not cyber warfare in the science fiction sense, but cyber warfare in the sense of a U.S. economy and a U.S. national security and a U.S. way of life that now depends on all of these electrons working in the right way, and frankly, all based, for the most part, on systems that were never developed with a sort of security in mind against a sophisticated, concerted, nation-state, terrorist group, organized crime element that deliberately wants to break in and either covertly or overtly cause damage to U.S. interests. It's new, and it's new in the sense that it puts not just the Defense Department, not just the Pentagon computers, not just Defense Department logistics, but it puts you, it puts your companies, it puts your communities increasingly on the front line. Now, these capabilities overseas are being developed. They may be being developed by our own homegrown terrorist organizations. We haven't seen the sort of electronic Pearl Harbor. We haven't seen the World Trade Center, the Khobar Towers, the Oklahoma City in the cyber world. But it doesn't take much to put a picture together that says it's an issue that we have to worry about. And so it was about 18 months ago that the President signed what, for those of us who are cognoscenti of inside the Beltway, call a series of presidential decision directives, PDDs 62 and 63, that did two very important things. First, it reorganized the federal government for the first time, so there was actually a central coordination for dealing with the range of new threats that I was just talking about: chem bio, radiological, cyber. And secondly, and I think very relevant for this group today, it called for the creation of a national capability, a national plan for defending against the new threat of cyber attack. And that's what I've been dealing with. It's what a number of the government officials here have been dealing with over the last year. Now, the President's directive did two things that are very significant. One is it put very tight time frames in terms of actually producing results. I didn't come to Washington with the idea of pushing paper, and the President made clear that he wasn't looking for people who are interested in pushing paper when we're dealing with cyber attack. And so he set some very strict deadlines, including having a full-blown capability for defense against cyber attack by the year 2003. The other thing that the President called for was the recognition that this is not a federal government issue alone, and that in fact, for the most part, the federal government has relatively limited scope of action to deal with this issue. And therefore it called for developing, as part of a national defense, a real working partnership with the private sector and with state and local governments to address this issue. And that's a great deal of the work that I'm about, and that I hope that we can successfully advance in the next couple of days as the basis for further work. Because the simple fact of the matter is, you all own and operate all of the systems that are going to be the subject of these intrusions and these vulnerabilities. For the most part, it is not the federal government that owns them. We can address internally our own problems within the federal government, and we have many, and I'll get into that in a second. But ultimately, it's your systems that even the national security apparatus of the federal government depends on very directly. What I wanted to do very briefly this morning is context really for a lot of the discussions I know that you're going to be that are going to be taking place both in the formal sessions and I think equally importantly informally today, is walk through the elements of the work that we have underway right now. It's probably not accidental. I started off by saying that I have a dependency problem, and so it's probably not accidental that I'm about to lay out a 10-point program. These are not sequential steps, by the way, but and apologies to all the programs that do have 10 or 12-step programs. But it gives you, I want to give you a sense in terms of where we are in our thinking and in our work, and not only where we are, but what remains to be done. Because very explicitly, and what I'm about to present to you is in fact going to be published as a report to the Congress, to the American people, in some detail. But very explicitly, we're calling our plan to protect America's cyberspace, we're labeling it version 1.0. Because we're taking a page from the software industry, we recognize that what we have right now is only a step on the way towards, in fact, creating a national capability for defense against the sort of sophisticated and organized
cyber warfare capabilities that are now being developed around the world. And we hope, in fact, we're not certain whether it's going to be version 1.1 or version 2. We fully intend that in the coming months we're going to have subsequent iterations of our plan that are going to further expand on the work that we're doing. And I think most importantly, as we go into versions 1.1, 1.2, 2.0 and the like, a lot of our work is in fact going to be concentrated on describing and helping to support, from a federal perspective, the work that needs to take place in industry, in private companies, in the university community, and in state and local governments. We are right now still very heavily federally centric in our work that the President called for. We recognize that as something that we need to use as a base in terms of developing what is truly a nationwide defensive capability. Okay, my 10-point program, organized under 3 overarching goals. Goal number 1, before we're attacked, before we face major intrusions, let's identify the vulnerabilities that are in systems and let's fix them rapidly. I think one of the things that we've learned as we've worked both with a number of the major providers of the sort of critical information infrastructures that America depends on, whether it be the IT and the telecom companies, whether it be internally within the federal government, whether it be the railroad industry or the electric power industry or the banking industry, all heavily dependent on electronic media. I think one of the things we've learned and come to appreciate is just exactly the extent to which all of the systems that we're using right now are full of holes. They're like Swiss cheese. In some cases, that Swiss cheese has holes that were apparently deliberately introduced. In many cases, it hasn't. But in all cases, we recognize that we've got to identify what our critical vulnerabilities are, and we've got to fix them. And we're actually starting that both by working with a number of the key players in the private sector, but equally by putting our money where our mouth is, where our policy is, by starting to fix the problems, the information security problems that the federal government has. The President has called on the federal government to be a model of information security. Well, I can assure you that the federal government is a model of information security. For the most part, it is a model of what you don't want to do. And we are, for the first time, taking seriously the need to address this. And let me give you one little vignette. It turns out that there's many hardworking people in all of the major departments across the federal government who have been dealing with information security. But very interestingly, it turns out until we created it recently, there wasn't a single person in the government whose job it was to look across the departments and say, gee, what the Department of Defense is doing might be really applicable in the Department of Transportation. Or maybe what the Veterans Affairs Administration has is a really good idea that could be shared elsewhere. There wasn't a single person in the federal government doing that. So we have a long ways to go, and as part of the 40% increase in next year's budget, up to about $1.5 billion, we're focusing a lot in terms of improving our own internal security. We have a long ways to go. We have a lot to learn from you. I think we have a lot actually that over time that we can share with you in terms of what works and what doesn't. But it's a very important, it's a thankless task. It's not glamorous, it's not sexy, but it's very important. We see the need for it. We think there's a strong economic reason why industry and state and local governments needs to focus on it too. Next slide. Goal number 2 focuses in on what happens when we actually do face a threat, an attack. Because cyber attack, it's not like counting missile silos in the former Soviet Union.
It's not like counting tank brigades that are massed in Eastern Europe. It's not like doing the sort of forced projections that so many people and so many dollars were spent to protect us during the Cold War. It's a lot different, and we have to think about how we're dealing with that. And we have to think about that because really for the first time, as I mentioned, it's not just an issue of protecting U.S. bases against Soviet missiles that are flying over the northern Arctic regions. It's about protecting U.S. companies that are being intruded into. It's about putting together patterns of intrusion data that might indicate a sophisticated terrorist or economic intelligence operation. And there's been a long tradition, and I think it's probably been an appropriate tradition in years past, when companies, God knows I've been part of organizations before I joined the federal government that did this, when companies, universities and the like had a serious breach of information security, one of the first things that generally happened was the agreement that no, the feds weren't going to be brought in, no, the local police wasn't going to be brought in, and unless it was really, really serious, it was going to be it would be dealt with in-house. Well, that was perfectly fine, and I think probably very appropriate when we were dealing with a world of disgruntled insiders and individual or small groups of hackers. It's totally inappropriate when we're dealing with a world where what you're experiencing might be one facet of a much larger intelligence or terrorist or national security threat. And there are those sorts of incidents in very widespread locations going on right now. And so part of the challenge that we've been facing is developing the sort of architecture that for the first time brings together federal law enforcement, state and government officials, the intelligence community, and actually most importantly, decision makers within industry in a mechanism that actually allows us to look at the pattern of intrusions and decide whether there is a serious national security, domestic law enforcement issue coming along. And we've got several elements in our 10-step program for dealing with that. First is pushing the envelope in terms of the deployment of intrusion detection systems, firewalls, enterprise-wide management systems, investment in malicious code scanners and pushing the state-of-the-art there. Essentially taking the best of the COTS and the GOTS world and creating it into packages that can provide multi-level protection for critical systems, both within the federal government, and we'd like to think that a lot of the work that we're doing is going to be applicable and is going to is for U.S. industry and is in fact going to create markets for U.S. security products worldwide. Our third program is for the first time bringing together the law enforcement and the intelligence communities. You know, there's historically and for very good reasons been divisions between what the FBI and domestic law enforcement can do and what the intelligence community can do. And for very good reasons, the CIA cannot spy on U.S. citizens. But we need a mechanism for recognizing that we're dealing with an international, a transnational, a multinational threat here. And we need, consistent with law and the protection of civil liberties, a way that different people can talk to each other. And so we've created for the first time what's called the National Infrastructure Protection Center, which under the guise of the FBI is bringing together all of these different capabilities so that there is in fact an ability to create a picture of a threat, of a warning. And I think even more important in terms of building this integration of law enforcement is working with key sectors in the economy. This month, as a matter of fact, the banking industry is going to be setting up for the very first time a pilot where major financial institutions, the banks, the stock exchanges, a number of the other financial institutions, are creating an institution, a capability where they're going to, on a confidential basis, share information amongst themselves about vulnerabilities and intrusions and threats. And perhaps if we work out the details, there'll be an ability for the federal government to brief on a trusted basis these people, this organization, in terms of what we know about vulnerabilities and threats, and perhaps even vice versa, coming from the banking industry back to the appropriate law enforcement people. It's an exciting experiment. It's one that's being followed closely behind by the telecom industry and a number of the CERTs around the country. We expect a lot of progress in this area. But we're starting to build for the first time a trusted set of groups that can talk to each other without fear that the yellow tape is going to come up and their name is going to be on the front page in the newspaper tomorrow. They can talk about intrusions, about vulnerabilities, about what they're seeing. Not because we're interested in the disgruntled insider operating alone, but because we are interested in some of the other nations and some of the other terrorist groups that are targeting the U.S. and looking at disruption of our banking industry, of our transportation industry, as a means of attacking what they hate about us. Next slide. We're also, fourth program, pushing the technological envelope and taking, really building off of some work that's been going on within the services, within the Department of Defense, to build next generation intrusion detection systems. Essentially, taking existing COTS and GOTS products and recognizing that the next step there is really to link and network those intrusion detection capabilities, whether it's detecting intrusions and anomalous behavior from outside, or whether it's detecting anomalous behavior inside the system. Linking those systems together into a network of systems and providing artificial intelligence and increased analytical capabilities. First, for the most part, it's going to be human capabilities, but increasingly automated AI capabilities, so that an attack or an intrusion or anomalous behavior on one part of a network of critical systems can be instantly identified and known to all, and so that we have a pattern, we have a program of automatic as well as policy and human-based responses for dealing with that. This is going to require some R&D. It's beyond the current state of the commercial offerings, but we see it as something that's well within the technological horizon, and we think that it's going to provide great capabilities, both in terms of protecting some important federal systems, first for the Defense Department, second in a parallel system for non-Defense Department critical systems. But we'd like to see it also consistent with protection of civil liberties migrated into an offering that's capable, that's available for U.S. industry as well. And we see this as a very exciting area. And finally, at the bottom of the page, could you move the slide up just a little bit? And this is very relevant for Y2K. Is creating a nationwide capability for responding to and reconstituting to cyber attack. In the days when we used to worry a lot more than we probably worry today about widespread nuclear attack against the United States, the Federal Emergency Management Agency spent a lot of time worrying about reconstituting what would happen to the nation in the event that important nationwide systems were destroyed or degraded. Well, fortunately, the Cold War is over, at least for now. And FEMA has focused much of its attention recently in terms of things like hurricanes and other natural disasters. Well, cyber attack may not respect the boundaries that natural disasters follow. You know, cyber attack may not just damage Florida infrastructure. Cyber attack may not just damage the Southern California basin. Cyber attack conceivably could knock out important nationwide systems. And I'm not making this up. I mean, we saw small examples of this when the Galaxy 4 satellite went out for non-intentional reasons. I mean, who knew until it went out that 95% of the pager network depended on a single satellite. Well, there are other single points of dependency, and we're concerned about those, and we're concerned about ensuring that if in fact they are degraded or damaged, that we have a nationwide capability to reconstitute them. It's relevant for Y2K because Y2K isn't cyber war. I mean, we did it to ourselves. On the other hand, we have a good idea, but we don't know with certainty what's going to happen in Y2K. And it's important that we start to build the sort of backup capabilities, most of which are going to be in the private sector. They're going to have to be in order to provide the sort of reconstitution and rehabilitation of information systems if they're knocked out. And we're going to take the lessons from Y2K, and then we're going to build off of those in terms of a nationwide system for responding to an information warfare attack. As I said, this is not going to be legions of federal computer scientists warehouse someplace waiting for their black helicopters to take them off. It's going to depend for the most part on you. It's going to depend on federal coordination and a framework that the federal government can provide. But it's mostly going to be a private sector-based system focused on restoring what matters the most to you. This is just a little schematic. I mentioned earlier the next generation intrusion detection systems. And this is just a little schematic of the work as we would conceptualize it, where different systems represented by the different circles would themselves have both external and internal intrusion detection systems, abilities to identify anomalous behavior. And we'd have information flowing with the appropriate automation and artificial intelligence to centralized network centers that can provide both the response and perhaps improved defenses, as well as rehabilitation and reconstitution of systems, both on a manual and on an automated basis. Next slide. I mentioned before, and I just want to pause here as I'm going through the 10 programs, just to say very briefly, I've talked in terms of the banking sector creating these information sharing, creating an information sharing center. There's a number of questions that are out there. We've never done this before, and there's a lot of different experimentation that's going on. Are we going to have one information sharing center? Are we going to have many? And so on and so forth. I do think that it's an important area, and it's one that we definitely want to be working with you on. Go ahead. In our 10 steps, our third goal is what we call build strong foundations. R&D is a very important part of this. Let me just note that next year we'll be spending well over $500 million in federal R&D. The federal government wastes money. We waste money on R&D. We don't want to waste money in this area. And an important way in which we don't want to waste money is we need to know what your R&D and research priorities are. Because there may be excellent opportunities in which the federal government can be spending money in terms of basic research where your companies don't necessarily see a market, but you recognize that the technologies have long-term potential. And if you leave with nothing more in terms of R&D than this message, we would like to be working with you to understand what your priorities are to shape the money that the federal government is going to be spending in this area. People don't oftentimes think of education as being part of information security and defense against cyber attack. I do want to emphasize that it's an important element in our work. We are starting up in the FY00 budget, which starts this next year, some work in a scholarship for service program. The idea being, essentially, it's not a military program, but in some ways it's modeled after ROTC. The idea being that we would be providing scholarships at accredited institutions for students studying information technology, computer science, information system security. And the rub of that is, of course, they'd have to work in the federal government for a period of time. Now, after that period of service, if they want to go off and you want to hire them at 3 times the salary, that's great. In fact, our goal is to increase the overall supply of Americans who are trained in this area. We see a desperate shortage of Americans who are trained in information systems, security, and information technologies. We see a scholarship for service program as being an important first step in this. It's certainly not the last step. And I know a number of the companies that are probably represented here today spend a great deal in terms of training and education. We'd like to be working with them. Why don't we go on to the next slide? And finally, last 3 of our programs, we'll be launching something similar to the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, what we call the Partnership for Critical Information Security, as a vehicle for industry to jointly act with the support of government in improving our security for information systems. We'll be working with the Congress in terms of not only the budgetary federal requirements that you all are looking for to demonstrate that we're putting our money where our policy is, but also in terms of revisiting some of the landmark statutes that define what we do in information security to ensure that they are up to date. And cutting through all of this, we're going to be working very closely with the Congress, with all of you, with representatives of legal groups and those who are concerned about civil liberties and privacy, to ensure that as we are protecting information security, as we are dealing with this new and evolving sophisticated threat, that we are strengthening the sort of civil liberties and protection of Americans' privacy rights that, frankly, so many of those around the world who want to harm us hate. And that is going to be a very important part of our work. So those are the 10 programs. Why don't we skip that slide? Those are the 10 programs. Let me just leave you with the notion that there's a lot of the work that we're doing that, in fact, is something the federal government can't do. I've outlined 10 programs. They're all funded in the President's forthcoming budget. We'll be spending a lot of effort across the White House, the Defense Department, the Department of Veterans Affairs, Health and Human Services, the intelligence community, FBI, Secret Service, the Commerce Department, Treasury. Everybody is involved in this. We're working with the electric power industry, many senior leaders in banking and finance, a number of software and hardware manufacturers in this area. I've laid out 10 programs that are a start, but there's a lot of work that actually needs to be done that the federal government can't do, and I don't want to be really explicit about that. We can't set up the sort of information sharing mechanisms that you need to discuss amongst yourselves what your vulnerabilities are and who is intruding into your systems. We can help, but we really can't do it ourselves. There are people here from the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the National Security Agency. They can help, but in terms of the sort of best practices or good practices and standards for information security, that's something that industry needs to come together around. And it's, I think, one of the desperate crying shortages that are there. And we need to raise the awareness of decision makers and of regular Americans about this problem. So with that, let me leave you with, actually the next slide after that. Let me leave you with a little bit, my job of contact information. My job is, and the job of the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office, and my new job at the National Security Council, is effectively to be connecting the dots. It's to be working with you in developing a nationwide capability. Email is Jeffrey_A_Hunker. Not a very user-friendly email address, I admit. We'll deal with that later. First things first, at nsc.eop.gov. That's National Security Council, Executive Office of the President.gov. And I'd encourage you also to work with the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office. Their email address is chow@ NCR, which is nationalcapitalregion.gov. So with that, I'm delighted to be here. And once again, as I said at the beginning, ciao, baby. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That's a fast exit. A small ad. They say don't leave home without it. One of you left it. I want to thank you for sponsoring the party tonight. The anagram, the letters M, J, K, come outside and claim.